If you've ever found yourself comparing every ordinary day
You're
to some
doing grand,
brighter version
Mikey.
of the past,
Just like that.
waiting for a feeling you're sure used to come easy, this story is for you. It's about an old thing everyone assumed had stopped mattering, and two people who never quite agreed on what to do about that. What still lives doesn't always look the way you remember it looking. Here's where it begins. A rumor moved through Oakridge County that July, passed from porch step to porch step faster than the drought itself. It concerned a well nobody had thought about in years, and a stubbornness nobody could quite explain. The 6th week without rain had turned the roadside grass the color of old rope. Cracks in the clay fields had widened to the width of a hand, spidering out from fence posts and dry irrigation ditches. Dust hung over the gravel roads long after any truck had passed, settling slow and pale over mailboxes, over porch rails, over the hoods of parked pickups. Even the crows seemed to have gone quiet, perched motionless on fence wire instead of calling to one another the way they usually did at that hour. At the Saturday farmers market, the talk was all wells and pumps, water pressure and worry. Folding tables sagged under half-empty crates of tomatoes and sweet corn, the produce smaller than usual, the vendors more subdued than the season called for. Someone had chalked a sign near the entrance asking customers to bring their own water jugs if they wanted the community pump refilled. One particular farmer kept coming up in the conversation that morning again and again in a tone somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Earl Whitfield had heard the joke 3 times already that morning, and he suspected he'd hear it a dozen more before noon. Neighbors leaned toward his vegetable stand, half teasing, half genuinely baffled, wondering aloud whether he still hauled water up with a rope and a wooden bucket like it was 1930. One man wondered, only half in jest, whether Earl was simply waiting for the rain instead of bothering with a modern pump. A woman nearby laughed and added that her grandfather used to talk about a well just like that, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually seen one still in use. A younger farmer, new enough to the county that he didn't yet know better, asked flatly whether the water even ran clean out of something that old. Earl only smiled, tucked another tomato into a paper sack, and said nothing. His silence, more than any answer he might have given, seemed to amuse people even further. It was the kind of quiet that could be read a dozen different ways: stubbornness, pride, simple old-fashioned habit, and nobody in that market that morning guessed the real reason behind it. Earl had learned long ago that a man defending himself only fed an argument that didn't need feeding. He'd rather sell his tomatoes and go home. Further down the row of stalls, the county extension agent had set up a small folding table, handing out drought advisories printed on pale green paper, urging farmers to check their well levels weekly and report any dramatic drops. A line of concerned faces gathered around him throughout the morning, comparing notes on water tables and irrigation schedules, their voices tight with a worry none of them bothered to disguise. Earl caught snippets of it as customers drifted between his stand and the agent's table. Talk of drilling deeper, talk of trucking in water, talk of a summer that showed no signs of relenting before September. Beside him, his wife Dorothy heard the same words drift past her, but her mind had already wandered somewhere else entirely, down the dirt road that led away from town, back toward a version of their yard that no longer existed. She busied her hands with folding empty burlap sacks, the motion automatic, practiced, requiring none of her attention. A neighbor, Ruth Ann, stopped by the stand to ask after Dorothy's tomatoes and lingered a moment too long, the way old friends do when they sense something unspoken. She mentioned, gently, that she hadn't seen Dorothy at church in a few weeks. Dorothy answered with something vague about the heat, about needing to rest more these days, and Ruth and let it go without pressing, though her eyes stayed thoughtful as she walked away. In her memory, the old well was never a punchline. It was the center of something loud and alive. Children's laughter bouncing off stone, feet running circles around the well housing, summer evenings crowded with people who had long since scattered to other towns, other lives. She could still hear it if she let herself. The particular pitch of her daughter's voice at 9 years old, calling for someone to turn the crank faster, the low murmur of neighbors, gathered on the porch steps with glasses of cold water, sweating in their hands. The specific creak of rope against wood that had, for decades, meant home. The fields around her were thirsty, but it was the silence of her own yard that pressed harder against her chest, a silence no bucket of water could fill. She folded the last sack, set it on the stack, and did not join in when the conversation about Earl's well drifted once more into laughter. The heat did not break the following week. If anything, it tightened its grip, the kind of dry, breathless heat that made even shade feel like standing too close to a stove. Farmers across the county began speaking of their wells the way people speak of ailing relatives, in careful tones, checking on them daily, hoping for news that never quite came. By the second week of August, the situation had stopped being an inconvenience and started being something closer to a siege. 2 farms over, a pump coughed, sputtered, and finally gave out, drawing nothing but air from a well that had served 3 generations of the Bennett family. The sound of it, a hollow, wheezing failure, audible even from the road, carried further than anyone expected across a county gone quiet with worry. Within days, 3 more wells in the township had dropped below their intake lines, their owners driving into town with empty tanks strapped to flatbed trailers, hoping the county co-op still had water to spare. That Sunday, with Earl checking fence line on the far side of the property, Dorothy walked out to the backyard alone. The old well stood where it always had, a gray stone ring worn smooth at the rim, its wooden pulley frame silvered by decades of sun and weather. Wildflowers had gone brittle in the beds beside it, their color long since bleached out by the relentless light. She dipped an old tin cup into the bucket beside it and splashed water across her face, more out of habit than need. Her eyes lingered on the groove worn into the stone by the rope, deepened year after year by hands she'd once known well, her mother-in-law's hands, her own hands decades younger, small hands belonging to children now grown and scattered across 3 different states. On impulse, she reached out and turned the crank herself. The pulley resisted at first, stiff with disuse on her part alone, then gave way with a low, groaning creak that seemed to echo across the empty yard. The bucket dropped into the dark below, and for one unguarded moment, the sound carried her straight back to a crowded porch, to bare feet slapping across sun-baked dirt, to laughter that no longer had anywhere in the present to land. She could almost place the exact summer of that memory, almost name the faces around the well that evening, before the image slipped, as it always did, just out of reach. She let go of the crank. The rope stopped its slow unwinding. The creak faded into silence, and with it, whatever fragile warmth the memory had briefly offered. She did not see history in that groove anymore, not really. She saw only a relic, something old, stubborn, faintly ridiculous, clinging to relevance in a world that had already moved on without it. The well felt like a museum piece standing in for a marriage grown quiet, a yard grown empty, 2 people growing old inside a house too big for the silence they now shared. One particular summer kept surfacing in her mind, more insistent than the others. She had been perhaps 35 that year, her daughter barely out of grade school. The porch crowded most evenings with neighbors who dropped by simply because the well made a natural place to gather while waiting out the heat. She remembered a specific evening when a sudden thunderstorm caught them all outside, everyone laughing and scrambling for the porch roof. Someone's radio still playing from an open truck window, water running in sheets off the well housing while the children shrieked and refused to come in out of the rain. It had felt, at the time, like the kind of evening that simply repeated itself forever, one indistinguishable from the next, never needing to be treasured because there would always be another. She hadn't known, standing there decades ago, soaked and laughing, that the evenings would eventually stop repeating. Nobody ever tells you which ordinary night is the last one of its kind. It simply becomes the last one, quietly, without ceremony, and you don't find out until years later, standing dry-eyed beside the same stone in a silence you never asked for. She let out a breath and turned back toward the porch, leaving the well to keep whatever secrets it still had. Memory has a strange power over stone and wood and rope. It coats old things in a certain glow, the glow of everything we've lost, until the object itself becomes less a thing that works and more a thing that mourns. We look at what belonged to the past and grieve for who we used to be beside it, forgetting that life was never something that only happened once, in one place, to one version of ourselves. Does the ache of remembering sometimes blind us to whatever quiet, ordinary life is still moving right in front of us? A well was never built to be a monument. It was built to keep giving day after day to whoever came to stand beside it, indifferent to nostalgia, immune to grief, simply present, simply full. Somewhere beneath the stone, water that had never heard of yesterday sat waiting, patient, unaged, ready to be drawn. The past does not need our permission to end. It only asks, gently, that we stop mistaking its absence for the absence of everything else. Earl paid no attention to the gloom that had settled over the yard, or to the whispers that followed him from the market into town, into the feed store, into conversations he wasn't even present for. Each morning he went about the same small tasks, unhurried, methodical, the way a man moves when he has done something so many times it no longer requires thought, only attention. He checked the pulley's wooden axle for wear, running a thumb along the grain to feel for splintering. He wiped rust from the iron chain, link by link, working a cloth soaked in oil down its short length. He crouched at the well's edge and listened, the way his father had taught him decades earlier, for the faint echo of water far below, water that had never once, in Earl's memory, dropped past a certain point, no matter how dry the summer, no matter how many neighboring wells had failed around it. His father had dug that well by hand, back before the war, choosing the spot not by luck, but by close attention, a season of walking the property at dawn, noting where the grass stayed stubbornly green when everything around it had gone brown, where the ground stayed cool underfoot, even in August. He'd sunk it barely 15 feet before striking a shallow vein that fed itself from somewhere close and constant, untouched by whatever happened to the deep aquifer other farms now drew from with their electric pumps and their drilled casings running 80, 90 feet down. It wasn't magic, and Earl had never once claimed it was. It was simply a well placed exactly where the land had already been trying to say something, decades before anyone thought to listen. Other dug wells in the county, placed less carefully, had failed years ago. Earl remembered at least two, abandoned and capped, their owners long since switched to drilled pumps like everyone else. He knew that too, and never mentioned it when the teasing came, because pointing that out felt too much like arguing, and arguing had never once fixed a dry well or filled an empty bucket. That afternoon, Leo came around the side of the house. 8 years old, sunburn across the nose, visiting from town for the week, drawn to the well the way children are drawn to anything that moves and makes noise. He circled it twice, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, before working up the courage to touch the rope. Earl didn't explain anything, not at first. He simply guided the boy's small hands onto the wooden crank, showed him how to lower the bucket at an angle so it would tip and fill instead of floating uselessly on the surface, and stepped back to let him work. The pulley groaned to life. Creak, creak. The wooden wool turned, slow and stubborn, cutting through the stillness of the yard like something waking up after a long sleep. Leo strained against the crank, tongue poking out in concentration, and laughed out loud when the bucket finally broke the surface far below and began its slow rise. Once the bucket was up, Earl showed him something else, how to lower an ear near the stone rim and listen, the way his own father had once shown him, for the faint sound of water, settling far below after the disturbance of the draw. Leo pressed his cheek almost flat against the cool stone, eyes wide, and asked in the plain, unguarded way children ask things, whether the well ever ran out. Earl told him, simply, that it hadn't yet, not once, not in his whole life, and that his own father had chosen this exact spot because the ground here never quite dried out the way it did everywhere else. Leo seemed to accept this the way children accept most things that sound true, without needing further proof. Earl straightened once the bucket had fully risen, easing a hand against his lower back the way he did more often now than he liked to admit. He glanced toward the kitchen window, without quite meaning to, half expecting to find it empty the way it had been most afternoons that summer. He had noticed the silence in the house lately, the particular quality of a rest that wasn't rest at all, but something closer to absence. He hadn't known how to ask about it without making it worse. So instead, he had simply kept doing what he knew how to do. Tending the well, tending the fences, tending whatever small, steady things still asked for his attention. Dorothy stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, and found herself actually watching. Not remembering, not comparing, just watching, the way she might watch anything unfamiliar. She saw the muscles working in Earl's forearms as he steadied the frame for the boy. She saw the bucket rise, brimming with water, so clear and cold it seemed to hum in the afternoon light, catching the sun in small, moving fractures. She saw Leo's face crack open with delight when the first splash hit his sneakers, and heard him ask, breathless, whether he could do it again. For the first time in longer than she could name, the well wasn't a relic of a story that had already ended. It was doing exactly what it had always done, right now, in front of her, for a child who had never once heard the joke that had followed Earl through town all week, and who would likely never think to ask why anyone found it funny at all. Leo came bounding up onto the porch a few minutes later, cheeks flushed, sneakers soaked through, and asked Dorothy whether she'd ever gotten to turn the crank when she was his age. She told him, honestly, that she hadn't grown up on this farm at all, that she'd married into it, into the well and everything else, long after it was already old. Leo seemed to find this fascinating in the particular way children find any adult's past fascinating, and asked what the yard had looked like back then. Dorothy started to answer with the version she always gave, crowded, loud, full of people who no longer visited, and then stopped herself partway through. Instead, she told him simply that the yard had looked different the way most things eventually do, and that she was only just now getting used to how it looked this year. Leo accepted this answer too, the way he'd accepted the one about the well never running dry, and asked if he could try the crank one more time before dinner. Dorothy said he could, and found herself following him back down the porch steps to watch. Asterisk word of the Whitfield, well spread, quickly once the miller's pump finally failed for good, the motor seizing with a metallic shriek that Mrs. Miller said she'd remember for the rest of her life. Nobody made a show of it on the Whitfield side. Earl simply carried 2 buckets across the fence line one morning and told his neighbor, plainly, that there was water to spare and no reason to go without. By early afternoon, cars had begun pulling up along the gravel drive, tires crunching slow over the dry ruts. Families arrived with jugs, buckets, empty milk containers, anything that could hold water, forming a loose, patient line that curved from the porch steps out toward the well. Some of the very same people who had teased Earl at the market now stood quietly in his yard, waiting their turn, saying little, studying the stone rim and the wooden pulley with an attention they had never given it before. One neighbor lingered at the gate for a moment, plainly embarrassed, shifting his weight from foot to foot before Earl waved him forward without ceremony. Earl only said the bucket was right there if he needed it, and turned back to steadying the rope for the next person in line. There was no lecture, no mention of the joke from weeks earlier, no pointed silence meant to make anyone feel small. Earl simply worked, the same unhurried rhythm he'd kept all summer, as though nothing about this moment required comment at all. An older man near the back of the line, one of the loudest voices at the market weeks before, finally spoke up while waiting his turn. He admitted, quietly, that he'd meant nothing cruel by the joking, that it had simply seemed strange to him, a well like that still working when everything modern around it was failing. Earl only nodded, handed him a filled bucket, and told him not to think twice about it. The man carried his water to his truck looking, for the rest of the afternoon, noticeably lighter than when he'd arrived. Dorothy moved through the gathering crowd, filling cups, wiping a child's chin, laughing quietly at something one of the Miller girls said about the water tasting better than what came from pipe. She refilled a kettle for an elderly widow 2 farms down who hadn't left her porch in weeks, and found herself, without quite meaning to, asking after the woman's grandchildren, listening to the answer with real attention instead of the polite half-listening she'd grown used to. Ruth and arrived near the end of the afternoon, filled 2 jugs, and stayed to help Dorothy carry cups back to the porch, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm of conversation neither had made time for in weeks. A young couple who had only moved to the county the previous spring arrived last, apologetic about intruding, unsure whether they even had the right to ask a neighbor they barely knew for something as basic as water. Dorothy waved off their apology before they could finish it, filled their 2 jugs herself, and asked how their first year of farming had gone so far. The young wife admitted, with a tired laugh, that it had gone nothing like she'd expected, and Dorothy found herself saying that it rarely did, for anyone, in any year, a small honesty that seemed to relax something in the younger woman's shoulders. The yard did not look anything like it had in her memory. Different faces, different voices, none of the children she remembered from decades before, no trace of the specific laughter she'd spent all summer half listening for. And yet it was unmistakably alive. Not a copy of the past, not an echo of it, straining to sound the way things used to sound. Something entirely its own, unfolding in real time, filling the same space the old memories once had, without needing to resemble them at all in order to matter. By evening the crowd had thinned to a trickle, then to nothing. The last neighbor thanked Earl with a nod and carried his filled buckets down the drive, boots crunching gravel into the dusk, his shadow stretching long and thin across the dry grass. Dorothy stood at the edge of the yard for a moment after the last car had pulled away, listening to the ordinary quiet settle back over the property. Crickets starting up somewhere near the fence line, a screen door easing shut somewhere down the road. It was the same quiet that had unsettled her all summer. Tonight, for reasons she couldn't quite name, it didn't feel empty at all. Earl joined her on the porch steps, once the last of the buckets had been carried away, easing himself down beside her with a small groan he didn't bother hiding. He mentioned, in his usual unhurried way, that the Bennetts had asked about bringing a larger tank by later in the week, and wondered aloud whether the well could keep up with that kind of demand through the rest of the month. Dorothy said she thought it could, and found she meant it, not as a hope, but as something closer to a fact she'd simply never bothered to notice before that day. She asked, after a moment, whether he'd minded all the joking at the market. Earl considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly, without any need to fill the silence before he'd actually thought it through, and said that a man could stand being laughed at plenty of times over, so long as the well kept doing its job regardless of what anyone said about it. He added, almost as an afterthought, that his father had never once explained himself to the neighbors either, and that he supposed some things simply carried forward whether a person meant them to or not. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She looked instead toward the well, its stone rim catching the day's last light, and thought, not for the first time that summer, but for the first time without any sadness attached to it, that some things carried forward exactly the way Earl said, quietly, without asking permission, simply continuing to be useful long after anyone remembered to be grateful for them. The sun dropped low behind the western ridge, spilling long gold light across the yard and turning the dust in the air to something almost gentle. Leo refused to go inside, just yet, even as his mother called once, twice from the porch. He sat on the stone rim, legs swinging, dipping his fingers into the overflow puddle beside the well to pop small bubbles glinting in the last of the light, utterly absorbed in a task that meant nothing to anyone but him. Creak, creak. The pulley swayed gently in the evening breeze, its wooden joints murmuring the same worn, familiar sound they'd made for as long as Dorothy could remember. The same sound that had once meant a yard full of people, and now, tonight, meant only this: a boy, a breeze, a well still doing its quiet work. She walked toward it slowly, no longer glancing down the road, toward whatever version of the past used to live at its end. She stopped at the well and rested her palm flat against the stone. It was smooth beneath her hand, worn cool despite the day's heat, shaped by decades of fingers that had come before hers. Her mother-in-law's hands, her own younger hands, the small hands of children who had grown up and moved away, and now, however briefly, Leo's hands too, small and sunburnt, and utterly unaware of any of the history layered beneath his fingertips. Dorothy said nothing. She only watched the water catch the last of the light as it dripped from Leo's fingers and let a small, quiet smile settle onto her face. Not for what the well used to hold, but for everything it was still, patiently, giving. The stone had never stopped being useful. It had only been waiting, the way water waits beneath dry ground, for someone to notice it was still there. Somewhere behind her, faint and unhurried, she heard Earl's boots on the porch steps, coming to see. What was keeping them both outside so late? She didn't turn around right away. She stayed a moment longer, palm on the cool stone, listening to the pulley settle into stillness, and to the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely present sound of a summer evening that had, without her quite realizing when, become something worth staying in. Earl came to stand beside her without a word, following her gaze toward Leo, who had finally abandoned the puddle and was chasing something small and quick through the grass near the fence line. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing that needed saying, not about the well, not about the joking that had followed them both through town all summer, not about the particular ache that had kept Dorothy standing at windows for weeks, looking toward a road that led nowhere she actually wanted to go. Somewhere down that same road, other wells were failing, other families were driving into town with empty tanks, other kitchens were quieter than they used to be for reasons that had nothing to do with drought at all. Dorothy understood, standing there with her hands still resting on the worn stone, that none of that would stop simply because one well in one yard had held. But she understood, too, that holding on wasn't nothing, that a single well, placed carefully enough, cared for patiently enough, could still matter to more people than the two who lived beside it. Leo's mother called once more from down the road, and this time the boy came running, sneakers slapping wet against the dry grass, waving something small and green he'd caught and immediately released. He disappeared around the side of the house without a backward glance, the way children do when a day has been entirely, uncomplicatedly good. Dorothy finally let her hand fall from the stone. She turned, at last, toward Earl and toward the house behind him, its windows catching the day's last light. The well stood quiet behind them both, patient as it had always been, asking nothing, offering everything, exactly as it was built to do, not a memory of who they used to be, but simply, steadily, still here. Have you ever kept something everyone said to replace, the way Earl kept that old well? Or did a place only feel alive again once you stopped measuring it against the past, like Dorothy's yard? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear. Thank you for spending this time with the Whitfields. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and whatever quiet, patient things still take care of you.